Now, it's an eschatological sign, or celibacy is an eschatological sign, but once again, just like marriage, it's a efficacious sign. It effects a change, or it does something for those who embrace that call. Okay, so we'll talk about that for a minute. What does the celibate give up? He actually gives up nothing. As Father Karapi would say, you don't give up anything, you exchange lower things for higher things. When you give up children, when you give up giving birth to your own children, what do you get? Luke 18:29 says you get more children. And you get more children than you would if you were to give birth to them. So you don't give up children at all. You exchange having natural children for having spiritual children, and even more of them. And you're able to bear children spiritually because you have a supernatural spouse. You're in a mystical marriage. Remember when God said, when he had created Adam before he created Eve, "It is not good that the man be alone. I will make a helper for him." Well, instead of a human helper, the celibate receives a divine helper or partner. God becomes his lover and helps him to fulfill his call to love. So he's no longer alone, and he does have a helper. Celibate men become husbands and fathers, and celibate women become wives and mothers, spiritually. Just as Christ forewent earthly marriage in order to enter a heavenly or a spiritual marriage, so celibates seek and do likewise when they forego earthly marriage. So men choose and desire instead to marry the church and have spiritual children, and women choose and desire instead to marry Christ and have spiritual children. That's why nuns wear rings traditionally. What about sexual pleasure? They may be married to God, but God is not sexual. And that gets into the story about Diana. I told you how when I was a seminarian, I went home to work for the summer. And Diana couldn't wrap her mind around this, And so she asked me, "Well, you going to be a priest?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Well, don't you want to get married?" I said, "I am getting married. I'm going to marry the church." And she said, "Well, you can't have sex with the church." And I said, "Well, there's more to life than sex, And she said, "Well, you've only said that because you haven't had sex." And I said, I go to the seminary with a guy who's had a lot of sexual partners, and he had a steady girlfriend that he was in a sexual relationship with, and now he's studying for the priesthood, and he wouldn't have it any other way. And he is a priest today, by the way. And she said, "Well, he must not have had very good sex then." And what can you say to that? I can't say, yes, he did, because she's not going to believe me, and I can't say no, because then I would admit she's right. So I just kind of chuckled and left it at that. And often reflected, did I answer her properly? And I think maybe there might have been a better way to respond to her, because she puts such a value in sexual pleasure. But with the celibate, sexual desire is redirected. So we said the physical is a sign of the spiritual, and sexual desire, the physical urge, corresponding to a deeper spiritual urge, which is union with God. And this deeper spiritual pleasure is something that the mystics experienced to a high degree. And all of us are supposed to experience this as well. It's called infused contemplation. It's a deeper level of spiritual union with God where we experience deep in our soul something akin to sexual pleasure, something greater. Now, I'll begin with an analogy. There are some parts of the body that are more sensitive. Okay? Pain and pleasure are felt more acutely in some areas than others. Similarly, the soul is more sensitive than the body. If we grow enough spiritually, we experienced what is called infused contemplation, where the soul experiences this deeper pleasure. I heard a contemplative nun one time describe how she experienced this for the first time, and she talked about how she was just embraced and enraptured in this blanket of love, and time just flew by. She was there for an hour, and it felt like moments, and she could have just stayed there forever. I would say that the greater the fidelity to your celibate call, the more deeply and profoundly you're going to be touched spiritual in this way. And it is greater and more profound than sexual pleasure. Now, sex is more exciting, okay? The heart rate increases, your breathing gets heavier. With mystical union, it also has a physical, there's a physical manifestation, but it's more relaxing. The heart rate slows down. The breathing gets deep and slow. It's not as exciting, but it's more intense. Just like God is not really loud, he speaks in the silence. And yet in the silence, he speaks louder than any of us can ever speak. Now, even when I pray, and I don't think I've ever experienced this, maybe once, but there are times where I'm touched very deeply and embraced by God and his love. And I'm single and I feel that pain sometimes. But when I experience this deep joy in prayer, I think to myself, I want to stay single so I can spend more time in prayer and experience this more. In other words, this experience of love is greater than the experience of marital love that I would have if I was married. Now, all this considered, it shouldn't surprise us that many in the Christian tradition have said that celibates tend to be happier than married people. Okay? Something called the Catechism of Vocations, written by an anonymous Vincentian father. It's online if you ever want to read it. It's pretty good, and he speaks to that. And that's actually corroborated by Father Andrew Greeley, who's a priest sociologist, and he's quite, he's not exactly, I don't know how to put it. He's not exactly very conservative, I'll put it that way. But he says too that, you know, in his studies studying, comparing priests and Protestant ministers, he's found that priests oftentimes tend to be happier than the married Protestant ministers. Now, why is this? Because Wade's first law of spirituality says so. The more you give, the more you get. No. Father Thomas Dubé, I think, answered it well. He read a book of his one time. He talked about how he's given retreats. He's given a lot of retreats. He's given a retreat to every group under the sun, to mothers, to teenagers, to recovering alcoholics, to every kind of group under the sun. And he said the happiest people that he encounters are the contemplative nuns, the ones who just stay in the convent and pray. And he said, and that is because more than anyone else, they were living the way we were created to live. Okay? The Baltimore Catechism used to ask the question right from the start, why did God make you? To know him, to love him, and to serve him in this life, and be happy with him forever in the next. And nobody does that more than the contemplative nuns. When I was in St. Louis as a seminarian, I used to go and offer or serve for evening prayer on Sundays. And one time it was a special occasion and they invited us behind the cloister. And so we were having snacks with these sisters, and I couldn't get over how giddy they were. They were just, it was just like they were little schoolgirls, in love. And we're talking 50, 60-year-old women who were just, like I said, giggling like little schoolgirls because they were in love. And they were in love with the perfect man. So to Diana, it would have been best for me to convey that we experience in celibacy and in the spiritual life, when we grow spiritually, a deeper and more intense pleasure than sex. And my friend Josh in the seminary, who had had a lot of sexual partners, he experienced this and realized this is the reality that sexual pleasure just points towards. He did a holy hour every day at the seminary, and he still does. Now, I tended to experience this relationship as well with the church. When I was in the seminary, I think I was given the gift of celibacy for the time that I was there. I believe that. I was given that gift. And I desired marriage, but I desired celibate love even more. I didn't really think about marriage or desire it that often. It's kind of like, I like pancakes and I like steak, but I like steak more. And so, if there's pancakes there and there's steak, well, I'm thinking about the steak and I eat the steak and I don't really think much about the pancakes because the steak's better. That's the way it is. I remember I went to the St. Agatha's, the Latin Mass parish, and I remember going there for the first time and I just fell in love with it. And I would explain it to people, and I was going into the Diocese of Bismarck, and I knew I'd never be able to serve this parish, but I wanted to, and I explained it to people. It was like I've fallen in love with a woman and I can't have her. There was this really deep passion I had for this parish that's really akin to anything I've ever felt for a woman that I've been attracted to, and I think it was a deeper desire. Now, as we spoke about the Eucharist, the consummation, Holy Communion is where we experience this nuptial union with Christ. Christ gives his body for the bride, the two become one flesh. And I used to think about, I was pretty sure I was supposed to be a priest, and I thought about my ordination and my first Mass. Of course, priests always celebrate a first Mass afterwards. And I always considered ordination to be my wedding and thought of it in those terms. And my first Mass as being my wedding night. And another seminarian told me the story about a priest that he used to know in the seminary when he was at college. He said every time that priest would celebrate Mass, would come for the consecration, he would cry because he was consummating his relationship with his bride. Now, quick note on complementarity. All this stuff we said about celibacy, does that mean it's better than marriage? Actually, it is, according to the teaching of the church. I'll just give you this quote. Pope Pius XII. This doctrine of the excellence of virginity and of celibacy and of their superiority over the married state was revealed by Jesus and St. Paul. So it was solemnly defined as dogma of divine faith by the Council of Trent and explained by all the fathers and doctors of the church. Okay, does that mean that celibates are holier than married people? Celibacy is the sure or the more direct path and the easier path to holiness. But as St. Francis de Sales says in Introduction to the Devout Life, we know there's a lot of bishops and priests out there that aren't as holy as a lot of lay people out there. And so you have to correspond with the graces of your state in life. Now, there is an objective superiority there. Tends to make it easier to be holy as a celibate. Doesn't always happen. But just because there's a superiority, that doesn't mean they're in opposition to each other. There is a complementarity there. Celibates see in married couples a visible and concrete example of what they already have with God, that's spiritual marriage. Whereas married people see in celibates and their lives the life they are all called to. They see the celibate witness in the celibate witness their ultimate destiny, which is heavenly marriage and union with God.